Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by Affirm Press. I posted recently on Instagram about a novel published last month and how the central dilemma in that book was something every parent of teenage children could relate to. But more than that, the novel explores many contemporary issues facing society on a daily basis. It was a compelling, relevant and gripping novel that ramped up the tension page after page and had me sitting on the edge of my seat until its thrilling conclusion. I am, of course, talking about One of Us is Missing by BM Caroll, also known as BM Caroll, published by Affirm Press last month. And I'm excited, listeners, to have Burr join me today on the podcast to chat more about this fabulous book. Hi, Burr, and welcome back.
Hi, Claudine. Thank you so much for having me.
I wanted to say congratulations formally on the publication of One of Us is Missing. Does the feeling of holding your book in your hands ever get old?
No. I think every book feels like a mini miracle and they all go through a different journey. For me, anyway, maybe I need to learn how to make it the same and save myself some grief. But it's always a small miracle when the final product is produced and it's on the shelves. So I'll never stop feeling grateful or excited or terrified.
As I said before we started recording, it's been some time since we last chatted on the podcast. I think it was back in 2019. In that time, as I mentioned, you've written another 4 books, Who We Were, then it was You Had It Coming, then The Other Side of Her, and now One of Us is Missing. One at least each year for the last 5 years, 12 books in total. And that's prolific in anyone's estimation. Do you ever think, I don't know if I can come up with another idea, or I don't know if I can write another book?
I do think that sometimes I do have ideas. The question is trying to expand the idea enough to create a novel out of it. And with this book, for instance, I got the idea for this book in 2019. So there's a big gap between getting the idea and having a finished book in your hand. And that's not a bad thing because it needs percolating time. It needs time to sit in my brain, particularly in the case of this one. You know, I was delighted with the premise, the idea of a family of 4 going to a big stadium concert and one of the 4 going missing. I was delighted with that premise. But when you sit down to write the novel, that's another story. Like, I mean, what on earth has happened to this person? That's a real problem to solve. So it's not a lack of ideas, I think, that I have a problem with really, or that I'm scared of. It's, can I execute this? Can I pull it off? That fear is real every time.
It's always interesting when somebody is producing so many books, and 12 books is no mean feat. Do you ever have that fear that the ideas, that well is going to run dry one day?
I think because of where I get my ideas from, I get them from everyday family life. And particularly the last 4 novels, I can look at my own immediate family and say, that's where that idea came from. That's where that idea came from. So teenagers and, you know, family, you see the best of them and the worst of them, but they are also very inspiring because they're going through life at different stages to you, and they make you remember things that you went through at that age and experiences, and your world suddenly becomes broader again when you've got young adults in your life. And so right now I have to credit my children with being they're so well trained, Claudine, that, you know, my daughter will come home from work and go, mom, this happened, this would be really good in a book, this happened. I'm like, thanks, Ash. That might find its way into a book in 5 years time. Thanks. As you probably know from talking to authors, a book is lots and lots and lots of ideas. You might have your premise, but you've got to write 100,000 words, thereabouts. And so it takes lots of strands and lots of ideas to produce. I think whilst I have ideas for another few books, the question is, have I got enough there to bring the whole thing to fruition? Have I enough there to scaffold that premise?
When we talked about the missing pieces of Sophie McCarthy, I think that book marked a change in genre and direction in your writing. And the subsequent books that you've published have all been in the domestic noir, thriller, crime space. So I wondered if you could talk to me about that change in direction and what sparked it.
It just came from somewhere inside, I guess. I think people assume because I was an accountant in my previous life that I'm extremely logical when it comes to my writing. And they're always really surprised that I'm the exact opposite. I don't plan anything. I probably should plan things. And it would be great if I had this market strategy that said, oh, Burr, write thrillers because maybe you'll sell more books. I didn't. I just did it because I wanted to. And everything I do when it comes to writing, I do because I just want to. Sometimes, to my detriment, and sometimes not. And so when I was writing The Missing Pieces of Sophie McCarthy, it was my 8th novel. And I had written 7 novels of kind of contemporary fiction, but they were contemporary fiction with an edge. There was always a mystery, there was always angst, there was always actually, I think there was a dead body or 2. And so there were crimes, but they were dressed up as contemporary fiction. And I remember my first novel was really a corporate fraud that was dressed up as a romance. The romance readers were quite disappointed when they read my first novel. I always had that element in my writing, but when I got to book number 8, I thought, I've done 7. I wouldn't call my novels similar. They haven't been similar at all, but they had all this Irish Australian theme. They all had quite a strong corporate side to them. A lot of them were set in the corporate world. And I thought to myself, I just want to do something different. I want to do something different. I want to write a character that people won't know whether to like her or not like her. And so that change came from within me, and I just followed that instinct. And when I finished it, I knew I had a very different kind of book. And to me, it felt right to change my name to kind of herald to readers, well, this is a different kind of book. But it wasn't done with any great market strategy, as in, oh, I'm going into crime now. And in fact, when it got longlisted for, the David Awards, I was actually kind of astonished. And I still, all the way through, when I've since been shortlisted for the Ned Kellys and the David Awards, and I'm still a little bit surprised that I have found myself in this genre, because to me, I'm still writing about families, but with a different slant, a different emphasis.
So, as previously mentioned, One of Us is Missing is one of those books that every parent can relate to. And I loved learning a little bit about your inspiration for writing the book. But for the benefit of those who haven't yet read it, I wondered if you could tell me about the story and what was it that got you thinking that this was something you wanted to explore in a novel?
Okay, so the novel, as I mentioned previously, it's about a family of 4 who go to a large stadium concert. It's actually a fictional Coldplay concert that they go to, and by the end of the night, one of the 4 has vanished. As the remaining family members wait outside the stadium and the hours pass and the police become involved, we begin to learn some things about this family, and we learn that they've been struggling in the months leading up to the concert, and that they've been keeping secrets from one another, they've been deceiving one another. But we also learn that they have more enemies than what they ever realize, and there are people out there who want to hurt the family. And so that's the premise. As I kind of alluded to earlier, it came from a direct family experience. Not that I lost one of my children at a concert, I didn't, but in 2019, my family and I attended a U2 concert. And when we were booking the tickets, as has happened to many people with Taylor Swift and all of the mega concerts that have happened recently, the clock was ticking down on Ticketek. And I think the tickets went on sale at 3 o'clock. And by 3:03, the tickets were gone, essentially gone, even though I was in there, they were essentially gone. All that was left were 2 platinum tickets together, which were really, really, really expensive, and a couple of general admission tickets. And I was like going, I am not able for the mosh pit. I don't want to spend that much on the platinum tickets, but we'd been fans of U2. We'd grown up with them in Ireland. And I guess my kids had grown up with them too, because we had played their music to them for years and years and years. So they were really keen to go. So my son was looking over my shoulder while the clock was ticking, and he was like, we'll be okay in the mosh pit. We'll be okay in the mosh pit. And so I ended up buying 2 platinum tickets for myself and my husband, and 2 field tickets for the children, who were 17 and 14 at the time. On the night of the concert, I was sitting up in my nice stand seat with my husband, looking down at this throbbing crowd, and I was just terrified. I was particularly terrified about my 14-year-old daughter, who didn't know the city very well, who was inexperienced in situations like this. I knew that her phone wouldn't work in the crowd either if something happened, because when the crowds get that big, phones don't work. And then I started thinking, well, what if somebody steals her phone, you know? And then I was also worried about her brother, who's 17 and completely overconfident. So at the end of the night, we had a meeting spot just in case they did get separated, and everyone turned up at the meeting spot. And I went, ha ha ha, I spent the whole night worrying about you. I didn't even enjoy it. Well, I did enjoy the concert, but you know. And so I just took that fear that I had. And I guess at the time I remember saying, this would be a good idea for a novel, somebody going missing in a crowd like this, because when you lose somebody in a crowd, you can't, they might be very close to you, but you can't see them. And the crowd is a moving thing, and there is nothing more frightening than losing somebody in a crowd, especially if your phones don't work, because we very rarely have plan Bs these days, because we're assuming we can rely on our phones. We have an over reliance on technology. And so really it was that idea that set in that night. It took me a few years of thinking about it to think about how I would flesh it out. But then once I started writing it, I wrote the first draft quite quickly.
You just managed to capture every parent's worst nightmare in those first few chapters, and even in the premise, that gut-wrenching fear of knowing that time is ticking and anything could be happening.
I kept putting myself into this kind of situation, and I decided that, you know, because Homebush and Allianz, not a lot of the people live around those particular stadiums in Sydney. And so I did think to myself, gosh, if that happened to me, at what point would you go home? At what point would you say, you know, the person isn't here, we're going to have to go home and, you know, reorganize ourselves? Or at what point would you leave the place where you lost a family member? And so I was, you know, thinking about that as well. And that's why I had the family live in Cronulla, because I kind of thought that's a good hour away on public transport. That's an inconvenient place to live if you've lost somebody at Moore Park in Sydney. Who's going to go where? What's going to happen? And so all the way through this novel, I was constantly thinking, I guess, of my own family and what I would do and what steps I would take and where my mind would be going.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about the structure of this book, Burr, because you really do toy with your readers by flipping between not only the different points of view, but also timelines. So we move between Rachel, Rory, Emmett, and Bridie, and we go backwards and forwards in time, with the day of the concert being the central pillar around which most of the action takes place. Why did you decide to craft the novel this way?
The novel wasn't originally crafted that way. Originally, the novel, it did have the 4 viewpoints, but it started 4 months before the concert, and it built up to the night of the concert. And I thought that was a great way to start the novel. I was really pleased with it. But then my publisher said, well, you know, this is a great family drama, Burr, but it's not exactly a thriller, is it? I've got to wait till halfway through to get to the thriller part. And I was like, okay. I thought it was a slower burn thriller, but you know, I wouldn't have quite called it a family drama. And he said, well, you're going there anyway, you're getting there. So, but you need to get there faster. It would be a lot more impactful if you started in the middle of the concert and flash back. And I said, okay, no problem. And I thought that would be a relatively easy change to make. But in actual fact, it involved rewriting the whole novel. Like in the original version, I was able to introduce the characters much more slowly. But because I started in the concert, I couldn't deny who was concerning who at that point, or what was concerning who. I had to be honest. I couldn't lie to the reader. So structurally, that was really difficult. But also, I had to write, I think, an extra 15,000 words to knit together the different parts. And as soon as I started it, I realized, oh, actually, this is not a simple restructure at all. Because even though the characters didn't change, the point of views didn't change, the themes didn't change, changing the structure in that way really involved rebuilding the novel. And so I ended up starting with a blank document and only bringing in bits once I was confident I had knitted them together properly. So it was extremely confusing. It was confusing because when I wrote the novel the first time, I knew exactly what the reader knew at what points. But when you're restructuring something like that, you lose track of what the reader knows because you already know everything. You're not writing it fresh. And so it was very technically tricky to do it. So I had said, "Oh, this is no problem," but actually it was a big problem, and it was one of the bigger rewrites I've ever had to do, in my career, other than one of my novels where I had to change the whole thing from third person to first person. And I think I had to do that with my fifth novel, and that was a pretty profound rewrite as well. This was a very, very tricky rewrite, even though some things didn't change at all.
I can imagine it would have been difficult to try and go back and make sure that you've laid enough clues and you've got enough in there to justify what comes later.
Yes, and one other thing I did change at that stage, and this sounds like it was a major change, but actually wasn't a major change. I changed the perpetrator. Kind of a big thing to change, but the person was there. I just added more things. I actually had fun with that part. That
Yeah.
was a bit like more like normal editing, going back in to drop some extra clues and massaging scenes a little bit to make them appear one way, but they're actually, something different. When the reader gets to the end, they realize, oh, that was actually something different to what I thought it was. And that was much easier. But it's funny how a structure, I guess, can change lots of things, and now I realize that yes, the other structure was probably more family drama, or probably just not scary enough, or they were waiting too long to find out, the reader was waiting too long to find out who went missing.
It's really an interesting point that you just mentioned about the protagonist, because in this novel, there is a bit of a prologue where you get some insight into some characters' thoughts. And you
Yes,
don't know who that character is when you're
yes.
reading that. But when you get to the end of the novel, I'm presuming that many readers will go, that must have been that person. And so Pam Cook and I were having this discussion. We were away on retreat a couple of weeks ago. And she brought up this novel as an example to the writers in the room about use of the prologue. She was very confident that she knew who that person was based on having read the novel and then going back and reading the prologue. And I said, "Oh, no, I think it's this other person." We didn't want to spoil it for anyone who hadn't read it. And she was like, "Oh, I hadn't thought about that." And I similarly hadn't thought about the person that she thought about. So it was very clever what you did there.
Well, I think you might be crediting me with more cleverness than what I deserve, because it's meant to be one particular person. But I did like, obviously, up until the point where it becomes evident who it is. Could be any one of a number of people up until that point, which is the tricky thing when you're writing those things. And those excerpts drive you crazy as a writer. They're very short, but I think I probably rewrote them. I probably spent 50% of my rewrite on those tiny, tiny sections, trying
Yeah.
to build intrigue, give it a little bit of layering, but not give away who it was.
What I especially loved about this book, Burr, was the way each of the characters are so well crafted. Each of them bring to the central dilemma their own worries and fears, their own particular sets of guilts and pressures, I guess. So I wanted to ask you, do you create a comprehensive character profile for each of your main characters before you start? Or is this something that evolves as you're writing?
It evolves. It totally
Mm.
evolves. In this particular case, it took several attempts to get it right, because I'm on my 12th book. I have no automatic kind of cookie cutter characters that I can rely on. I'm trying to create characters that are different to my previous characters, and that's getting increasingly challenging. And so it took a few attempts to get the layering in there. And I'm very grateful to the reader, my early readers, for their feedback, because they helped me decide who these characters were really. My kids helped me a lot with the teenagers in the book, trying to get their language and mannerisms and activities just right. There was a few points in the novel where they said that I sounded like a mum instead of a
Mm.
teenager, and
Yeah.
I was very grateful for that. I remember one particular discussion where we were talking about druggos, druggies, and junkies, and debating the terminology. And there was even a difference between my now 22-year-old and 19-year-old. There was even a difference of opinion between the terminology between their two ages. So I really used the teenagers in my house at this time to get the voices of the teenagers right and get the concerns of those teenagers right. And one of the themes in the book was teenage loneliness, which I think we can all still remember. So I think I probably had the emotions right, because I think that loneliness and uncertainty in our teenage years is just beneath the surface for all of us. I think we can all access it really easily if we need to.
Mm.
So they helped me more, I think, with terminology and making it a modern teenager, not a teenager from the 80s. And then my writing friends helped me to hone Rachel and in particular Rory. Some of their questions made me really think about Rory and Rory's story arc and who he was and who was he in his marriage.
I guess I was thinking back to when we talked about the missing pieces of Sophie McCarthy, and in that book, you had 7
I
different
did.
points of view, if I
I
remember
did.
correctly.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking at that time, my gosh, that you have nailed each of their individual voices and made them distinct characters. And in the same way, and this is quite tame in comparison because you've only got 4 different points of view, but you have managed to create very different voices for each of them.
In some ways, it's easier. It's easier when you have a family because in this case, you have a male adult, a female teenager, and a male teenager all talking to the reader. And in that respect, they were distinct. However, they all lived in the same house. So you had to sort of make sure that the settings were different enough when everything occurred so that the reader could visualize them in different settings so that they weren't mingling up with each other. Having said that, it might have been easier in one respect, but I've never taken on teenage voices before. And yeah, I won't be in a hurry to do that again. That was hard. That was really hard. In the missing pieces of Sophie McCarthy, I don't know what I was thinking. I think I was off my head when I was writing that book. And they're all in the first person as well. And I had numerous females in the first person of, similar ages. And it was so hard, but I think I knew those characters so well that in many ways they came out better formed, perhaps, maybe than this book. I had to work less on the voice. I do remember going back and making sure that when I had female characters of the same age or male characters, I went back to examine the voices against each other. I would take the 2 chapters and go, right, how are they different? How are they different? Are they different enough? Are there any techniques I can use to hone this voice? And sometimes it's words and sometimes it's just a few things they say, that helps you create the voice. But I mean, that was insane too. I won't be writing any more books with 7 characters written in the first person.
A little bit earlier, you were talking about how your kids helped you, particularly nailing the voice of the teenage characters in this book. But I think overall, what you've done really, really well in this book is tapping into the fears and worries of parents. But I also loved that you captured the many competing issues that our kids are facing today. And you talked a little bit about teenage loneliness earlier, but things like anxiety, just general anxiety and fitting in, friendship issues, as well as the online world. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that, Burr, and why was it that you wanted to talk about these issues in this novel?
To be honest, Claudine, it was impossible not to. I think you'd be hard pushed to find a teenager who's not going through a degree of loneliness, a degree of where do I fit in? Who are my friends? Are they really my friends? As soon as I was talking in these teenage voices, it was immediately apparent what the issues were. You couldn't avoid them because every single teenager in the country has those issues, no matter how confident or well connected they might appear on the outside. Of course, a lot of the time that's a construct, and behind it all, there is a lonely young person trying to figure out who they are and where they fit in and what their future looks like. And also, I guess with Emmett is of that age where he's coming to his last years at school, he's looking forward, he doesn't feel he's got any particular talents, and he's scared of the future and scared of being a failure. And, I could see that. I could see that those questions going through the heads of my children and of my children's friends. So to me, it wasn't, I didn't do it consciously. I just thought, well, if I'm going to hear from these teenagers, this is obviously what's on their mind.
And you also deal in some part with toxic masculinity and toxic female friendships as well. Tell me about that and how you came to be writing about these issues as well.
I think with the toxic masculinity, I've spent a long time around, I guess, young males. I've seen the best of them and I've seen the worst of them. And, God, they're tough on each other. They're really tough on each other. You get away with nothing. They very rarely praise each other or build each other up. And I think that women have a much more nuanced friendships,
Yeah.
perhaps. And sometimes men young men find themselves caught in a friendship circle, perhaps those people are not very nice to them. In fact, perhaps those people are their biggest detractors in life. And I kind of wanted to have a look at that. But while at the same time, I think there's a lot to be said for male friendships because they don't analyze things, to the nth degree like women do, like girls
Yeah.
do. And I think girls can have toxic friendships too. And I think adult women can have toxic friendships. I think sometimes friendships survive longer than what they should. And that old saying, friends for a reason, friends for a season, there's a bit of a truth in that. There are friendship issues in Emmett's world. Emmett is the young male teenager. There are friendship issues in Bridie's world, but there's also friendship issues in Rachel's world, the mum. And she has realized she has a friend that is not really there for her when she really needs her to be there for her. And Rory also has friendship issues because he doesn't have many friends outside of his marriage, and he's realizing now that he's in trouble and he needs somebody to talk to. He has nobody that he can talk to.
This family has had their fair share of trauma, and in the throes of dealing with that, experienced severe pressure. Did you worry that it was too much for them? Did you worry that, this family couldn't take another bad thing happening to them? Or did you want to test their mettle?
I wanted to test their mettle, and I think that when you experience trauma, it does test your mettle. Actually, it does. You begin to get things into perspective very quickly as to what's important and what's not important. And sometimes, because Rachel, the mom in this character, has been really ill, that has made her more kind of protective of her family in one way, but also has made her want to distance herself from her family in other ways and do some crazy things on her bucket list. And so I wanted to follow her through that journey where she has to reestablish kind of what's important to her. I mean, at the end of the day, I think the most important thing about this family that I wanted to portray, and I hope this is evident right from the start to the end of the book, and that is that they love each other. That even the siblings love each other. There's nobody in this family that hates anybody. I wanted to show that, and I wanted that to be the glue throughout the novel. No matter what happens or what has happened, they love each other. So, how could have something gone so wrong? What I'm sort of realizing is my niche maybe in this market is that I want my readers to largely like my characters and to identify with my characters. And that's important to me. And for them to be relatable and for them to say, oh my gosh, that could be me. That could be my family. That's maybe my trademark, I hope. Although I know I pushed that with the missing pieces of Sophie McCarthy. I think somebody recently gave me a 5-star review for that book and said, I hated every character, but I really loved this book. I don't know why. And I was like going, oh, I didn't mean you to hate every character. Am I really upset if you hated every character? That wasn't my intention at all, at all. And similarly with this book, even the villains in this book, I hope are nuanced and there's a reason why they do what they do.
I think it absolutely comes clear that this family are having a tough time, but that at the end of the day, they still love each other and they're going to stick by each other through this terrible ordeal. But I think what you've done so very well, give each of them motivations for behaving the way they did. We may not like what they did, but we can understand why they did it.
Yeah. And I think any normal family has secrets, right? They cannot be expecting to know everything about your family members, and particular teens keep secrets from their parents, and it's perfectly normal. So a lot of what they've done is understandable and within the realms of normal. In particular, the siblings, to me, it was important that there was love there between them. And I hope that's evident at many points in the novel, not just at the end.
This book is about, amongst many other things that we've already spoken about, the dangers lurking in plain sight. And I loved this description because it made me think of something I was taught back in law school many, many moons ago. Something along the lines of people are most likely to be killed by someone they know rather than a random stranger. Now, I'm not saying this is what happens in this book, but as a general concept.
Yeah.
And we know that in Australia, that statistic is especially pertinent for women. But was that something that you were keen to tap into while you were writing this novel?
I guess for me, the big question is this real? Is this real? What will make it real? What will make it real is that what's happening around you that has caused the situation to occur. There's not something too bizarre going on here, and that it's coming from a very normal environment and a very real environment. There's a big draw card like that when you pick up a thriller and you think, this could be me, this could be me, this could be my life. That could happen to anybody. And that makes it very relatable. And then when it's relatable, then that helps you to foster that fear for the well-being of the characters.
It was the kind of randomness, yet the lack of randomness of what actually happened that is so shocking.
Yeah. Oh, good.
But as mentioned, you are the author of 12 novels now. You've been published by several different publishers from around the world, and you're still pumping out a book a year. So, given all of those different experiences, I wondered if you had any tips to offer the aspiring author listening to this podcast today.
I don't know how I've produced a book a year over. I think you just looked at me over a very productive 5 years.
We'll say the last 4 years
I
or
think
the
I've
last
produced
5 years.
12 books over 20 years. The release dates have massaged the truth. I find it very difficult to produce a book a year, but I can produce a book every 2 years. I can, and I feel that the books are the better for the thinking time. I can definitely produce a draft in 6 months, but then it's what happens over the next 6 months to a year where I'm thinking about it, and a few people have read it and they're saying things and I'm thinking about what they've said. That's where I feel really elevates the book to the next level. And that's probably my first thing that I would say to aspiring authors is, your first draft might be very average, but if you really, really listen to what people say to you, and if you value the feedback, and if you get wide feedback, that is a resource that is so valuable. It's so valuable because you can then take that first draft, that unremarkable first draft, and you can elevate it to something completely different if you're prepared to do the hard work. And so feedback is extremely important, and being open to feedback, and being committed to allowing time for that feedback to kind of, process through your brain, and then say, right, I'm going to take this from this, I'm going to take that from that, I'm going to shift this way, I'm going to take this that way, I might change the structure, I might cut this character, I might make my chapter shorter. It can involve all sorts of things, but it can profoundly change the reader experience at the end of the day. So the other thing, and I know all authors say this, is, you know me, I'm an avid reader. I'm always reading a book. I learn something from every single book I read still. And even when I started off in this profession, I didn't know how to write a book, but I knew a lot more than what I realized because I'd been such a big reader. Very often people will say to me, how do you know this? And I'm like, I don't know. I did one creative writing class that was 6 weeks long in Mosman High School when I started. And it was a very basic creative writing class where we wrote a couple of short stories. It was not a novel writing class at all. But everything I've done from instinct and from using the feedback that's been given to me. So if you read books and if you listen to feedback and if you surround yourself with a good group of people, then I think that will help you write novels.
Ber, are you working on something else at the moment?
I am working on something else. I have that first draft ready and nobody has read it yet because I know that it needs. I've given myself feedback, Claudine.
I love it.
I have a list of issues with this before I'll show it, that I will try to fix before I show it to my first readers. It needs work, and once it's had that work, hopefully it will turn into something. It's good. All I can say is about a teacher who gets a death threat. Again, a fantastic premise, but trying to write 100,000 words around that premise is not so easy.
Ber, what can I say? It's always a pleasure to chat to you. And I just loved One of Us is Missing. It's the perfect read for lovers of crime fiction everywhere. And I wanted to say thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books again today.
Thank you, Claudine. Thank you for having me back on Talking Aussie Books. It's been an absolute pleasure.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.
is read it yet because I know that it needs. I've given myself feedback, Claudine.
I
And
love it.
I have a list of issues with this before I'll show it, that I will try to fix before I show it to my first readers. And hopefully, it needs work, and once it's had that work, hopefully it will turn into something. It's good. It's about, all I can say is about a teacher who gets a death threat. Again, a fantastic premise, but trying to write 100,000 words around that premise is not so easy.
Yeah, yeah, I can well understand. But what can I say? It's always a pleasure to chat to you, and I just loved One of Us is Missing. It's the perfect read for lovers of crime fiction everywhere, and I wanted to say thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books again today.
Thank you, Claudine. Thank you for having me back on Talking Aussie Books. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, that's so wonderful. I'm going to press. That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.